saying they're going to suspend their nuclear programme in exchange for food aid. Sounds quite dramatic, but what are the papers made of it?
Well, look at this piece in Foreign Policy magazine. They've got a long analysis of whether this is to do with the change of leader in North Korea. Obviously, we've been speculating ever since Kim Jong-il died and his son Kim Jong-un took over what that was actually going to mean for North Korea's relations with the world. What would it change? So is this why? Is he a more flexible interlocutor for the West? They're asking today. Essentially, they say no, this is a significant development, even though the North Korea retains enough plutonium for at least 4 atomic bombs, they say. But they have given up a significant amount of potential capacity, a significant amount of potential nuclear material that now won't be enriched because they've stopped the work and they've stopped nuclear and missile testing. So it is a big development, but it's not necessarily something we should connect to the change of leader, they say, because it's part of a long negotiation process between Washington and North Korea that was started under Kim Jong-il. And also, we shouldn't necessarily celebrate it too quickly either, because for North Korea, it's expedient. They have a famine going on. They have hundreds of thousands probably of starving people. Foreign Policy says pretty impossible for foreign journalists to calculate how many, because you can't get into North Korea, you can't go to the countryside and see how people are really suffering. But we know there's a famine going on and that they desperately need those 240,000 tonnes of high-protein food aid that are going to be sent, and which could even be used for propaganda purposes, of course. The article says they could be used just to feed people who are loyal to the regime. So it's very hard for the US to keep track on what it's even going to be used for. And so it's very much a mixed blessing, this agreement, they say. The Atlantic is even more cynical. They're headlining today, don't worry, North Korea's nuclear program will be back on track any day soon, with a propaganda cartoon there on their front page. They say essentially that North Korea has said it will suspend its nuclear program numerous times in the past as part of negotiations, normally when it was convenient for them to do so. They've subsequently restarted it clandestinely a number of times. Now, obviously, they say the regime is in an insecure place because it's just changed hands, and so they're just needing to keep the international community quiet while the new leader sort of stakes out his claim to the territory.
Another world hotspot is Iran, of course. General election there tomorrow. How's that being covered?
Well, there's an interesting article in Foreign Policy about this as well. They're looking at the rivalry going on between President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. Now, apparently they loathe one another, and Khamenei is trying to push forward really conservative candidates in parliament who oppose Ahmadinejad, who isn't conservative enough for the supreme leader's liking. Now, he's trying to apparently to push Ahmadinejad's faction completely out of parliament, meaning that all that will be left in the Iranian parliament then will be conservatives who've been part of the original regime since 1979 and a really far-right group who say they're safeguarding the ideological purity of the Iranian revolution. You notice in all that they don't mention the reformist groups that we talked about so much in 2009, when of course they took to the streets with the Green Movement. That's because, at least according to the Times, their popularity has almost totally disappeared in Iran. That's partly because people who were linked to that group were tortured and detained by the authorities and people thought it wasn't worth the sacrifice. It's also because of the economic reality. They say voters are much less concerned about democracy than we might hope in the West, and much more concerned about getting to the ends of the months now that the prices of things in Iran has been rising. That's also affected the popularity of Ahmadinejad himself. He's a populist who came to power by telling the rural poor that he would help them financially, essentially. He would help redistribute wealth. That's not happened, so they're disillusioned. And overall, the paper says we can expect very low turnout.
Very briefly, the Americans detained in Egypt for allegedly spying, they're set to be released.
Yes, they are. Washington hasn't confirmed that, but their Egyptian lawyers apparently say so. New York Times, though, reports that this remains very controversial in Egypt, where lots of people actually do believe that they're secret spies set up by the US to disseminate unrest rather than just working for an NGO. And they say the Egyptian government is bowing to American pressure by letting them go.
And surely the British press, they must have all headlined on James Murdoch after he's been forced to fall on his sword.
Of course, the non-Murdoch papers are having a field day. How could we forget that? Look at this front page from The Independent. Murdoch there on that front page, having resigned. Inside, they say that this scandal is quite likely to follow him to New York, where he's, of course, going to take up another job for News Corporation. They say that the US Congress is carrying out an investigation into whether or not British journalists for News International bribed the police. This is important because if they find out that they bribed foreign officials, they could take away Murdoch's licence to broadcast in the US, and thus, of course, the jewel in his crown, Fox News, which is much more important to him than some British newspapers.
It'd be intriguing. Elena, thanks very much. Elena there with the international papers on France 24. Still to come then, GM and Peugeot, they withdrew